Hi, everybody. This is Arlo Gilbert, co-founder and CEO of Osano, a leading data privacy management platform. And you are listening to the Privacy Insider Podcast. This show explores the past, present, and future of data privacy for privacy and business leaders alike, as well as anyone who wants to keep privacy top of mind. Welcome to the Privacy Insider Podcast. My name is Arlo Gilbert. I'm the CEO and co-founder at Osano, and today I'm your host. With the inauguration a few weeks ago, we've already seen a few tech-related developments. Trump issued a new AI executive order that places great importance on business and innovation. We've already seen some interesting announcements and alliances in big tech, including from Meta, Apple, and OpenAI. And we've seen renewed concern over Chinese companies from TikTok to DeepSeek and how they use our data. What does it all mean? What's real? What's noise? And what's the most important to us as privacy pros and as citizens? As you know, I don't like to make big predictions, but I love to get insight from people who know more than I do. And that's why Cindy Cohn is here today. I don't think anyone knows more about our digital rights and how they relate to government, global conditions, and big tech. Cindy is the executive director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, also known as the EFF. She's long been at the forefront of defending civil liberties in the digital world, including the right to data privacy. She and the EFF have taken on the NSA, the Patriot Act, and have long opposed the practice of surveillance capitalism. And now Cindy is working on a book that will come out next year. She's here to put it all into context for us. Cindy, it is great to have you here.
Thank you.
Well, welcome to the show. We'll go ahead and kick things off. We've got an exciting time in the world of data privacy and surveillance capitalism. A new administration has come in. But before we start talking about the nuts and bolts of politics and the world, it would be really interesting to understand a little bit more about you and the story behind Cindy and how you got into data privacy and fighting for people's rights to keep their data encrypted. How did you get here?
Well, I kind of fell into it, if you want the truth. I'm one of those people who always had the idea that, I was kind of put here on this earth to help. And some of that's the family that I grew up in. I grew up in a very small town in Iowa. And we were some of the only Jewish folks in town. And that kind of gave me an outsider's perspective and thinking about where you live in a society that is open to everybody. And the great thing about America is that you don't have to be just like everyone else. But we also know that the experience of not being in the majority requires a little protection. It requires a little thinking about it. So I started thinking about how I could help other folks. I was also adopted. I had lots of historical reasons why thinking about what it's like to not fit in very well is kind of deep in my core. And I got interested in human rights when I was in college. And I actually worked at the United Nations on human rights when I finished law school. And then I moved to the Bay Area and I met a bunch of crazy hackers. And this is in the early 90s. So this is before we had a World Wide Web. But these people were doing the things that I think most of us take for granted now, like living on one coast and working for an organization based on another coast and stringing Ethernet wire and having long digital chats with each other. And, distance didn't really make a difference in terms of your access to people and information. And I became fascinated with the possibilities for our world when everybody got to use this technology that my friends were. And, one of the people who I met early on is John Gilmore, who is one of the founders of EFF. And he was already thinking about what would we need to have privacy in the digital age. There was a group called the Cypherpunks. If you're kind of old school, you might have heard of this. They were thinking about, not just the tools, the way that everybody could enjoy the benefits of this world, but what are the things we were going to need to put in place to protect people's rights and civil liberties. And they asked me to do a lawsuit about protecting encryption technologies, because at the time, encryption technologies were controlled by the US State Department. They were on the list of weapons, along with like surface to air missiles and tanks, was software with the capability of maintaining secrecy. And, there's reasons why the government thought of cryptography as its own, but John knew, and convinced me and many other people that this was going to be an important technology to protect people's privacy in the digital age. So I signed on to help, and we ultimately won, right? The reason that people have cryptography available pretty easily and to protect our data, whether it's at rest or at transit, is in part because of the work that I and other people did in the 90s. So again, I kind of fell into this. I was an English major, but I've always been interested in how we build, a society that both empowers us and protects us.
I love that. I mean, nobody ever seems to get into these freedom fighting roles on purpose. It's always something that people accidentally stumble into. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the EFF and what it does, because it's a lot more than data privacy, right? I mean, how does that work with the data privacy pros are doing? How does that intersect with the EFF? Because a lot of people do think of you and the EFF as being encryption focused. And I mean, those are the fights that you got the most notoriety for. But tell us a little bit about the EFF and its origins and how it intersects.
Yeah, I mean, EFF is at this point, we are 125 people. We're the biggest and the oldest digital rights organization. And then in part, that's because people like John Gilmore and Mitch Kapor and John Perry Barlow, the three kind of founders, Steve Wozniak was involved early on as well, really saw the need to have an organization that was going to stand up for people's rights in this new world, this new digital world that was coming. And so they founded EFF in order to do that. People often say, oh, the early internet people were really starry-eyed about how good things were going to be. And I always point out that, like, you don't found a civil liberties organization we think everything's magically going to be okay. That's a bit of misreading of the history to try to posit backwards and think that nobody thought there might be fights for people's rights or unjust things happening online. That's not true. And in some ways, that kind of erases me and EFF from history. And part of the reason I wrote a book was to like correct the record a little bit, because this seems to be a cultural story we're telling ourselves about the early internet. And I'm like, well, hey, I was there. And that's not actually how, again, you don't create an organization like EFF if you think everything's magically going to be okay. So what are we? The biggest piece of our team is lawyers, impact lawyers who go to court or advocate in other areas for users of technology more broadly. And so we have a bunch of lawyers, we have a bunch of kind of lobbyists, might not be the right word, but people who focus on the congressional branch of government. Some of them are lawyers, some of them are not. But we also do something that no other group does, which is we have a very large group of technologists who advise us, who make sure that we're right and we're really grounded in how the tech actually works. Sometimes in policy spaces, they get a little divorced from how the tech works. And we're grounded in terms of what we think about it, but also the people that we have. And then we have activists, people who write our blog and make sure that things get out on social media and run campaigns. So if we're fighting something in Congress, we're not just in the halls of Congress advocating, but we're out there in public trying to talk to people. So these three branches, law, advocacy, and technology, are kind of the three pillars of what we do. And I think that what makes us really strong is that we bring all three of those things to bear on the situations that we addressed.
So you opened the Pandora's box here. You mentioned that you're writing a book. Tell us about this book. I know I'm going to read it, and I'm sure a lot of the folks listening today would enjoy it.
Well, I mean, again, there's a couple reasons for the book. One of them is to correct the record. I feel like sometimes the early internet, especially the first 20 years, is kind of only talked about in terms of guys and companies, We think about the early internet and people think about Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and, like as if we were looking at history and the only people we talked about were the railroad barons, right? And that's the only thing we talked about, the early America. Like that isn't true, but it's not the whole story. So I felt like if I was going to complain about this and, I kind of privately was complaining to my friends that like, I was there in the 90s and those guys were around, but they weren't the whole story. And why is the story all told about guys and their companies? And I was like, well, maybe I should put my keyboard where my mouth is and tell the story about what it looked like from where I sat. So that's one of them, and hopefully try to inspire more people to think that this is something you can do, that if you care about technology and you care about rights, going into, the corporate side might not isn't the only path. There is a huge, actually, I would say at this point, for me, stunning, since we were the only ones when things started, a huge digital rights movement. There's lots of people who are able to devote their time and energy to this. So I was hoping that my story might inspire more people. I'm pretty much always recruiting people into the idea of rights as a career that you can do and something you should put your talents into or volunteer. So, I wanted to correct the record. I wanted to inspire a few people. And there's some stories that I think need to be told about how important privacy is and how this fight is really as old as the web, even older, about protecting people's rights. So it's a professional memoir. It tells stories of three of the big privacy cases that EFF's been involved in that I've had the pleasure of leading. The first one is the cryptography wars, the cryptography fight in the 1990s. The second one is the NSA's mass spying programs. And the third one is a fight around national security letters, which are these secret subpoenas that I suspect privacy professionals in your community are more aware of than a lot of other people. But the government, in the Patriot Act, gave itself the power to issue secret subpoenas to tech companies and telecommunications companies demanding information about their customers and gagging them forever so that they could never tell anyone that this happened. And this has profound implications, not only for the privacy of the people involved, but because Congress periodically is supposed to look at these programs and decide whether they're good or not. And it really gagged the people who had direct experiences from being able to participate in the political process and tell Congress about the problems. And that directly happened to some of our clients. So those three stories are the three that I tell. And then I weave in some of my personal history as well, because I think if you're going to convince people this is a good way to spend your life, if you're just talking in the realm of the analysis or policy level thing, it's not engaging at the level that I want to engage. And I think there are a lot of people who analyze privacy and think about privacy, and some of them are really amazing, but I spent a life doing it. And I think that that's an important piece of the story.
It's funny you mentioned the telecommunications things. I actually owned a phone company in the mid 2000s. We were a voice over IP provider, but we were also a Elec. And I remember getting some of those notices from the government where we would have to turn over subscriber information. And yeah, we were absolutely banned from talking about it. And it was very weird. So, all right, let's talk a little bit more about the kinds of policies that you guys are focused on. So, for example, you wrote a white paper about privacy and civil liberties in 2023 that really aligns with our ideals and guidance on the subject. And I won't bore everybody with all the details of it, but privacy first regulations and practices are the best way to prevent most of our online fears from happening. So whether that's exploitation of children, AI misuse, surveillance capitalism, 2025 has already been off to a pretty wild start. So is there anything that you would add or amend to what you wrote in the 2023 paper? I mean, the world's already changed.
Yeah, it's changed a lot. I would say we wrote the paper because we kept seeing that in the cross set of issues that EFF works on, we were seeing really bad ideas floated to get at problems that we could solve if we thought about privacy first. And we saw this kind of across the board. Again, my intellectual property team saw this in the context of IP fights around AI. My straight ahead consumer privacy team saw this. My team that was working on trying to protect free speech saw this in the context of lots of proposals to try to weaken Section 230 or, basically make platforms liable for what people do on them. And we're all talking about, we're like, if we actually passed really good privacy protections that got at the heart of this problem, all these problems might not go away, but they would be very different. They would be very reduced because all of them basically are fueled by surveillance capitalism and the surveillance business model. So we wrote the paper to try to pull all these disparate strands together. So what's happened since? Well, at the time, the TikTok ban is a good example. Now we've seen worries about the Chinese government having access to all our data, but banning one little app is not actually going to protect people against Chinese spying. Why do we know this? Because we know about the data broker industry, and we know that there are many, many other apps and many, many other ways. It's like Swiss cheese. It's like blocking a tiny little hole in Swiss cheese and missing all the other holes and then keeping pouring the milk through and thinking that nothing would happen. It's not my best metaphor. But it seemed to us completely ridiculous that even if you're really worried about Chinese spying, TikTok isn't where you'd start. I don't even think it'd be on the third page of things that you would worry about. The data broker industry and the data collection, general privacy protection for all of the companies that are involved in spying on us, both the direct companies and the back end data broker industry, will give people protection against spying much better than banning one little app or two little apps or three little apps. And I think and TikTok's not little in the context of this, but it's little in terms of how much of our data is being collected by how many companies at this point. So this is another one, if I was writing the paper today, that I would add, if you care about national security, privacy first, right? We give people ways to stop all this massive data collection at the source and empower them. That's the way to deal with the national security problems that people are raising around data collection, data privacy. It's kind of funny, right? We've been talking about the problems with data privacy and the need to protect data privacy for a very long time. And suddenly the US Supreme Court and Congress are like, oh, we really need to care about data privacy. So here's this tiny little stupid thing we're going to do rather than the big thing. And we're like, wait, go over there and look here. There's a big thing you could do, and it would actually help people. That's one I would definitely add to it. But we're seeing age gating the internet. We're seeing, those other proposals are not going away in 2025 either.
So talking about 2025, it would be impossible for us to not talk about Trump, right? We have a new administration in place, and there is inevitably, no matter how anybody feels about the election, there's undoubtedly that he's the new president, and there's going to be impact on lots of different kinds of policies. So he's doing exactly what we expected. He's championing AI and innovation. He's talking about deregulation. Is there have you seen anything that's unexpected regarding digital policy, or anything that perhaps is throwing up red flags?
Well, I think that in general, what we're seeing is not really what I think of as deregulation in the kind of libertarian sense, right? Of shrinking the government and creating more space for all of us to compete and to live outside of government. What we're seeing is just actually, I think, shifting the reins of power from one set of people to another. And I think that's important to pay attention to in the frame that you're looking on, because lots of things are talking about government efficiency or shrinking the size of government, and it may actually reduce a little bit. But what we're really seeing is one set of people grabbing the reins of power and their team, right? We're just the old Rolling Stones song, meet the new boss the same as the old boss. We're just seeing bosses change right now for most of
Right.
what we're seeing. And I think that's an important frame, because I think, especially for a lot of technical people who deal with government regulatory structures, it can feel frustrating and you could wish there would be less hoops. But we need to look at, are there actually fewer hoops, or is it just that you have to play up to a different leader now rather than the bureaucrats who are in charge? So I think that's one thing we're seeing, and we're starting to see it really play out, that this was a campaign that was based on reducing government bureaucracy, but is actually just creating a new set of people who are going to be in charge of most of those reins of power.
Speaking of the people in charge, might be an awesome divergence into some of the interactions we've seen between big technology and Trump. I mean, they've all donated to the inauguration. We saw almost instantaneous post-election behavioral changes from all of the big online tech companies. And we're watching Elon and Trump. I don't know if they're camping out together in the White House and doing s'mores at night, but it feels like it's that intimate. What is your take on the interaction between big tech and, I guess I would kind of lump Elon in with big tech as his own thing of, he is a big tech. What's your take on the interactions there and the relationships?
Well, I think one thing that we're seeing, and I think it's really sad for a lot of the people who work in tech and care about tech, is that we're seeing a big cleaving between the people who work in tech and build the tools and the CEOs, the people who lead these companies. It used to be the case, I think, that you could join a company and feel pretty strongly that the people who are at the head of the company shared your basic values and look at the world in the same way you do. And I think a lot of tech workers are very sadly recognizing that's not true anymore for the people who are leading. Whether it was true or not before, it's not true anymore. And that I think there's going to be consequences from that cleaving in terms of talent, honestly, in terms of people really. It's unfortunate that some of this is happening, and I think actually predictable that this is happening as we've seen a very competitive landscape for technology companies that existed when I first got involved in this and in the early 2000s shrink into 5 big companies.
Yeah, it's
Um,
really
yeah.
amazing how fast it's all consolidated in the last 10 years.
And I think
Um,
it's that consolidation that makes it possible for the CEOs to chart such a different course from their workers. But I think there still will be consequences in the long run. They've really attracted the best and the brightest thinkers into their companies. I think they're gonna have a hard time keeping them as the tech company leadership really shifts from thinking about the public interest to currying favor in kind of a less democratic, a less due process kind of focus. And I think people still believe that it's better to not have dictators than to have dictators. And as the CEOs shift into the way you function when you're working under a dictatorship, I think we're going to lose some talent. And we're going to see maybe European companies getting the best and the brightest, or other people choosing other things. So I think it's problematic for tech in the long run to shift to this dictatorship
yeah,
strategy. I do human rights work. I've done human rights work alongside what I've done for alongside. I know what happens when you get a strong leader. I'm not calling Trump a dictator at this point, but I think that there is a strategy for dealing with one kind of leadership that's different than the strategy when you're dealing with a leadership that is committed to rule of law and due process. And we're starting to see those kinds of behaviors from the CEOs, and it's getting noticed. By the tech world. I also think that it's going to be short-sighted. So one of the things that I've been involved with in the last couple of weeks is that many of the people who build the tools of privacy and anonymity and free speech, they're used by people around the world, especially people who live under actual dictatorships, under repressive governments. The State Department has a little program, very small by state standards, that supports a lot of these technologies and doing the kind of plumbing work, right? Keeping tools like Tor or tools that help, create VPNs for people who are living in China or North Korea or other places to be able to do organizing and protect themselves. They pulled the plug on the funding for a lot of those little groups as part of the broader executive order in the State Department. And so I think it's really, again, I think that they are also taking kind of a bulldozer to a lot of things there's a lot of babies in the bathwater, let's just say. Even if we assume that there's a lot of bathwater out there, they're not paying attention to the babies in the bathwater in a way that, again, I think is short-sighted for technology. It's short-sighted for freedom. Even if you're prioritizing certain kind of freedoms over other kinds of freedoms, if you're prioritizing free speech and anti-censorship and religious freedom over some of the other kinds of things that are in the Universal Declaration, these tools help everybody. And they help those people too. And so I'm sad that this blunderbuss of growth, because people like Elon Musk should know better than that. They get a lot of general applause for being bulldozers and not caring about the consequences. And that's what we saw when Musk took over Twitter as well. And I think I just think it's short-sighted. I think that even if I think that making sure that the marginalized people of the world, by that I include all sorts of people who are doing there, all the way back to my childhood in Iowa, they need tools to protect their privacy and anonymity. It's one of the values that we care about for privacy. It's central for human dignity, but it's also central for organizing and making change. Unplugging all of those systems is going to hurt. It's going to hurt people in the short run. It obviously is. But in the long run, I think it's an anti-innovation strategy.
Interesting. Interesting. So talking about innovation right now is almost entirely, at least in the news cycles, entirely dominated by AI. And AI, for those of you listening, there's lots of kinds of AI. The kind that we talk about the most lately is large language models, but there are many other kinds of machine learning and AI. And I'm really curious, do you have any concerns around AI and this particular administration? Is there any particular focus on civil rights or over reliance on AI? I could see Elon trying to replace an entire department with, Grok or whatever they're calling it now, X.AI. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that's really problematic, right? We know that with great power comes great responsibility, and these technologies are very, very powerful. And you know, EFF has been involved for many years in trying to make sure that government use of AI is responsible. This includes people, again, you're right, people are focused on large language models, and we certainly have thoughts about that. But we're just talking about stuff that honestly, I don't know that even qualifies as AI, some machine learning and simple other government decision making that decides, do you get bail? Do you get out of jail? Are you getting called in for a lineup because a facial recognition system identified you? Are you going to have access? Are you going to get kids taken away because the model that the social services are using to decide if you're a good parent or not is running on an AI? These kinds of systems, and I think about separating them in some ways too. The systems that are trying to predict future human behavior are really where AI fails. And it especially fails people who are marginalized. I don't think you could be a professional at this point and not realize that these AI systems are really bad and misidentify women and people of color at a much higher rate than white guys, right? Why? Because they're replicating some of the biases and the things that they're being trained on. Garbage in, garbage out. If you're going to train a system up on a bias system, you're not only going to get bias, you're going to get actually double down bias. You're going to get more bias. Our friends at
Interesting.
Human Rights Data Analysis Group, which is my husband's data analysis group, discovered that if you've got biased information about what the cops do going into an AI system at like 50 to 60% bias, the actual machine learning algorithm they use will come out with 70 to 80% bias on the other side. So it's not just that AI replicates bias in society, it actually is looking for patterns. And when it sees them, it doubles down on them. So if you've got patterns of bias in the training data, now people are getting better at adjusting for that, but that's going backwards, right? Like create a bias system, then try to figure out how to adjust the weights not to be biased anymore. What a crazy way to think about the world, right? We should start with the baseline should be unbiased. So we have been working at this in the context of, again, police, this thing called predictive policing. It's been named a few times. Things around housing decisions, about governmental decision making in law enforcement and in regular kind of social services, health and human services things. And one of the things that was especially troubling in the first Trump administration was an effort to try to float a rule that said that if the machine made a decision about you, it wasn't appealable. There was nothing you could do about it because the machine's decision was final. I mean, that is exactly backwards, right? Like
This
that's
feels like
ridiculous.
Minority Report, where the precogs have decided that you have broken the law or will break the law.
Yeah, and we know that machines, I think this is an area where people who work very closely with these systems know better. And sometimes we know there's a cognitive thing where people, if a machine makes a decision, people tend to believe it. But I think people who work closely with these machines knows that's exactly backwards, right? That's just a way in which our brain is tricking us, and we have to fight that. So that's something we've been doing a lot of. We know that these systems are bad for predicting human behavior. So whenever you see AI system, they're not bad at predicting whether you want shoes or not. But I mean like the kind of human behavior that can get you arrested or could decide whether you get a mortgage or can
Yeah.
decide those kinds of systems or decide whether you're a terrorist. Those systems are especially bad because the training data, there just aren't very many of them to train up a model and they look very differently. So these kinds of systems are the ones that we should be very skeptical of, and I do worry that this is being lost in the rush to, apply a little AI fairy
It's
dust.
really it's really fascinating because you really have a tale of two cities right now. In some regions like Europe and in some of the states in the United States, there has been really progressive legislation that has said that you can't use machines to do automatic decision making about healthcare or whether or not somebody gets a mortgage. But it feels like in the United States, the pull from technology and regulatory is going to be much more about automatic decision making and increased reliance. And it just feels like it's at such odds with other countries and other people's views. Are we going into a world where there's like the US internet and then there's everybody else's internet because we can't play nice?
I don't know. I'm not sure if that's going to play out that way. I think there's a good chance of it. Splintering the internet is definitely one way that people deal with bad decision making at a government to government level. I think it would be such a loss, right? The great benefit of the internet was that people could really build connections despite physical distance. And I think if we unplug this main benefit, we're all going to be the poorer for it. But I do worry about that. And one of the things that the Trump administration did was repeal the Biden administration executive order on AI safety, which I think was really a good attempt to try to set up the guardrails and really frame the thinking about where AI was appropriate and where it isn't. And I think those are going to end up being important if we don't want people squashed. You can go too much with government. I don't think that government has all the answers either, but I do think government can be useful for setting kind of the outer boundaries, right? The fence lines that
Which
things
we need right
I
now.
think we
We are
could.
in the middle of developing essentially AGI or close to it. It would probably be good to have some rules in place.
Yeah, people can get and again, I don't think that they have to, you could quibble with whether the European approach, which is very rule-based and regulatory, is a good idea. We have some concerns about that too, because I think that's just going to empower the tech giants of today. I think it's going to mean that we are also a big fan of open source for models and AI training. I think that the DeepSeek model is better and more efficient because it relies on the open source models, and that if you care about innovation, like, you shouldn't want to create these big walled gardens that so only Sam Altman gets to decide what uses we make of technology, or Musk, or four of the current oligarchs. So we're a fan of open source models. I think that DeepSeek is problematic for some other reasons, perhaps, but in this who's better at AI faster, open is winning. And that's really important if you want to build a better thing. But what Trump did with pulling up the executive order was really remove governance entirely from a lot of these things, that in ways that I think are going to be problematic. So you want competition, but you don't want open season, right?
So I have two directions. You talked about two different things here. So one, you talked about the AI executive order being repealed. And when we talk about that executive branch, you in 2020, you gave the Biden administration a transition memo outlining key policy areas the EFF really thought would need to be focused. So I guess the first question is, did you do something similar with Trump, or are you guys delivering a similar memo to Trump?
We already did. You can find it on our website, and you can see, and it's a pretty comprehensive view of how EFF thinks about policy, the policy space. Obviously, I've got lawyers in constitutional law, and I got technologists building technologies, but in terms of the policy space for the executive branch in Congress, it's a pretty comprehensive look at our priorities. So yeah, the spoiler alert is it didn't change very much between them, not because the administrations aren't different, but because we're not different. Our policy positions, our philosophy, our view of what's best for the digital world doesn't really change. And we end up, the fights look a little different depending on who's in power, but we end up fighting either way, because it's definitely the case that the fighting for the principles of, freedom and justice and innovation online, like, those principles don't change depending on who's in power.
So if you had to grade the Biden administration, you gave them this memo in 2020, 2024 comes around, the teacher gets to look at their students and say, how did they do? What
Yeah.
do you think?
B minus to C, I guess. I mean, because it's hard, because it's overall, right? I think we agree with the Biden administration's work on network neutrality. We think that's important for building a competitive landscape. We were supportive of the executive order on AI. We thought that was pretty wise way to look at it and set the blueprint for what AI regulation ought to look like. We think that the increased antitrust enforcement work that was done is important, and that the competition law is really important to bring to bear to try to level the playing field and create space for new innovation and privacy. I think that the FTC and some of the other parts of the Biden administration did a really good job standing up for privacy and bringing serious accountability for privacy violations. So I think all of those are things that the Biden administration did pretty well. Absolutely disagree with them about the national security stuff. They were very strongly in favor of continuing mass surveillance under what's called Section 702 of the FISA Amendments Act. And honestly, it was the people on the right side of the aisle who stood with us to try to scale back the mass spying. We were able to kick the problem down the road for a couple of years, so it's going to come up again next year. But they also expanded who can receive some of these mass surveillance orders. So the Biden administration was not good on mass surveillance, and we're going to have another fight next year. And this will be a good situation to see where the rubber meets the road, right? Are the people in the Republican side of the thing who were concerned about mass surveillance when the Democrats were in power, are they just going to flip and be all fine with it when they're in power, or are they going to stand on the principle that we need to reduce?
It's funny how that surveillance state works. You hate it when you're not in power, but as soon as you're in power, it's not as bad as you thought it was.
Exactly. And so you become convinced of your own righteousness, right? And that's the real problem. So we'll see, right? You asked me, what do we think about the changes that the Trump administration is bringing? And this is going to be one of those tests that we're going to see. Are they going to walk their talk about shrinking the surveillance state? Or was that just a ploy to try to get themselves be the new bosses rather than the old bosses? So we'll see about that. That's an area where I think we gave the Biden administration, I would give them an F, a not failing grade, because I think it's in the interest of the American people to not let national security be like the thing you throw on the table and you win, right? Like rule of law and due process, like there shouldn't be basically an escape hatch to all of those protections for Americans just because you say the words national security. And both the Democrats and the Republicans have created this situation, and frankly, the courts. And if we're going to get to a place where we think about the American people as actually having real rights and being a free people, we can't have an escape hatch in our rights. I mean, this country was founded in a national security fight, right? That's how, like if national security was a thing that you laid down and stopped all fights, like the king would have done that and we wouldn't have a country, right? Like we were founded in a national security fight. It can't be the case that national security is suddenly now a reason that we dispense with all the freedoms that the founding fathers worked so hard to put into place. That's crazy.
There's the very famous quote, it's those who will trade privacy for security deserve neither, or something
Yeah,
along.
it's a Benjamin Franklin quote, and it's those
Yes.
who would trade liberty for security deserve neither, I believe. There's some version of that.
Yeah, that feels
Yeah, and
appropriate.
I think Ben was right, and the founding fathers were right. I kind of am a constitutional law nerd a little bit. Thomas Jefferson had a cipher, right? He used cryptography. He and John Adams, Jefferson is in Paris, right? And Adams at one point was in England, and Madison is in the US, and the rest of the founding fathers are in the US. And they're using cryptography to send messages back and forth about how they're going to overthrow the king, right? Like, I just think that if we want to not have a world in which we have kings anymore, we need to protect the means of private communication, like having a private conversation in the digital age. It's not just about protecting your porn habits. Fine, do what you want. I think in a free society, people get to make choices that might not be the ones that other people would make. And privacy protects that as well. It protects human dignity. It protects families. But it also has this kind of like foundational freedom value. And so I think a lot of people working in privacy, sometimes you get caught in the little minutia of it, or people are like, if you have nothing to hide, you should have nothing to
Right.
fear. I think that's really short-sighted. Like, privacy is one of the ways that we protect our freedoms. And just like free speech, like even if you don't want to go out and stand on a street corner and hold a sign, free speech is really important kind of piece of the plumbing that helps keep a society free. I used to joke that EFF was the plumbers of freedom.
So we're talking a little bit about people and their rights. Do you feel like Americans know enough about their rights when it comes to privacy? I mean, you guys are out there fighting these battles in courts and in Congress and everywhere else, but do you sometimes feel like the people you're fighting for don't know and don't appreciate? Do they understand what's at stake?
Yes and no. I think that if you do surveys, and they do these surveys regularly, people care about their privacy. I think that there are some people who need to know more. I think that's probably right. I think there's actually just a nihilism. There's just a sense that there's nothing you can do, that you have to give up. And again, the companies that want all our data want us to think that, right? They want us to think privacy is dead. And so we just have to get over it. And we have to live in this new world where we have no privacy. Who's telling you this? And why are they telling you this? If they can convince you that your rights don't matter, then their job is done. They don't have to take them away. You take them away yourself. EFUP was founded by John Perry Barlow, and Barlow, who I miss very much, he used to say, like, nobody gives you your rights. You have to take them. And that's the civil liberties organization. That's what we're there for, right? If everyone was just going to magically give you all your rights, like you wouldn't need them in the Bill of Rights. You wouldn't need them in the Constitution. You wouldn't need any of those things. Like a benevolent government that respects all your rights doesn't need any of the things that the United States was founded on.
Yeah, and I haven't seen a lot of governments that just kind of by default respect all your rights.
No, and besides, a benevolent dictatorship is not what we want. We
Yeah.
want the answer to a bad dictatorship isn't a benevolent dictatorship. It's scary the dictators. So anyway, so I think that far more people have given up and think that there's no way to get to privacy and then probably just don't know that that's a possibility. I do think privacy is a basic human right, and it's a basic human rights because all people want it.
Yeah.
Nobody wants a government agent sitting in your living room listening to you and your friends talk about whether you like the government or not, right? Nobody wants a world in which I love this. There's an old movie called The Lives of Others that's about the Stasi in East Germany and basically the guy who listens in to an activist. Like nobody wants to live in that world, right? But I think that we have been sold a bill of goods that the only way to make money on the internet, the only business model that works on the internet is one that surveils all of us. I don't think that's true. Maybe it means that the CEOs don't get their second island and maybe they only get one island, but there's plenty of money to be made in other business models other than the surveillance business model. And so I think that there's a business model of actually like advertising doesn't have to be surveillance advertising, right? There's lots of ways that, yes, I'm not saying that no advertising can happen on the internet. I'm saying the kind of creepy kind of advertising that tracks everything you do, feeds it into an algorithm and tries to predict what you're going to do next. That extra money that they make, that tiny little margin, isn't worth the trade-off for society. And that's why we think that surveillance advertising can go away and the internet can survive and thrive. So yeah, I think that people need to believe that they can have power and that they can fight back against this and that the world will be okay if they do. And I think all of those things are true. It's just hard, right? We're being drowned out by the people who have all the money and all the power who are trying to convince everybody that there's nothing that they can do.
All right. So, one of the things that we like to ask on the show in the vein of surveillance capitalism, which is a very scary word, just the phrase surveillance capitalism sounds like it ought to have a dun, dun, dun audio sound right after it. Is there anything that you do that you think of as like a guilty pleasure or something that you do that you wouldn't really recommend that other folks do with regards to their data or their use of their data?
Yes, of course. I would say that the thing that I feel really strongly about is part of the reason I love this job and the stuff we're doing is I like all the toys. I want all the stuff. I really reject the idea that the only way to, as I said, to have this kind of stuff is to have surveillance. I want all the goodies without all the surveillance. And so I feel like it shouldn't be a guilty pleasure to use your maps program or to use social media even, I mean, I have shifted away from the surveillance business models. I did that long before it was cool, but I don't like that I miss the things that I miss, the people that I miss who are not there. I don't think the abstinence kind of be a digital monk model is the right way or feel bad if you use technologies is the bad model. So I just kind of want to push back on your thing. I don't actually think treating this as a guilty pleasure is the right model because that makes people feel like they're the bad ones when they use these
Sure.
technologies, as opposed to they're the ones who are being forced into this ridiculous choice that nobody should be forced into, right? Like nobody sells you a car without brakes, right? We don't say, oh, well, here's this car, but then you have to go out and sort out 20 million different ways to decide whether you want brakes and windshield wipers, right? Like, and nobody would feel guilty because they put brakes on their car, right? Like, so I just feel like we
Mhm.
deserve all the toys. We deserve all the goodies, we deserve all the innovations, and we deserve not to feel bad because of the business model that they're on. And the way to do that, sadly, is comprehensive privacy protections, right? That's the thing. Like, just like nobody can sell you a car without brakes, nobody should be able to sell you a social media thing that tracks you and puts you at digital. That security risk as well as privacy risk.
I love it. The contrarian answer.
Well, I'm a fighty lawyer, right? I'm going to fight the hypo. So
Gotta love it. Well, Cindy, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure having you here, and we really appreciate all the hard work that you and the EFF are doing on behalf of all of the citizens of the United States and the citizens of the world. So thank you for joining us today.
thank you so much. I think that I really appreciate you having this and speaking to the community that you speak to. I have a podcast too called How to Fix the Internet. I really feel like people are circling the drain about how things are, and that unless we have a vision for a better world, like, we won't get there, right? You can't build a better world unless you can see it. So I appreciate you continuing to lift up, like, how do we get from here to there?
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Privacy Insider Podcast. You can find a full transcript of this episode and any show notes at osano.com. That's www.osano.com. And while you're there, get access to an excerpt of my book, The Privacy Insider: How to Embrace Data Privacy and Join the Next Wave of Trusted Brands, which is now available on Amazon for purchase. Until next month, take care. And remember, data privacy is a fundamental human right, y'all.